Hello. So good to be here today. So first of all, how many people here know about Oxfam? Ooh, lots of people. Okay, good. Yay. Amongst friends, then oftentimes I have to go into a lot about what Oxfam is, but I'll do that anyway for those of you who don't know that much about Oxfam. I am the regional organizer for Oxfam America. Oxfam America is one of 13 Oxfams around the world that make up the Oxfam International family. And Oxfam International and all the other Oxfams, we are an international relief and development agency. We work to find lasting solutions to extreme poverty across the world. And we do this in a number of different ways, actually. We're very well known for our emergency humanitarian relief work around the world. So when crisis happens, like hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, Oxfam steps in and helps communities get back up on their feet again. And we specialize in water and sanitation when it comes to emergency humanitarian relief work. Second, Oxfam works in 132 countries around the world funding development projects. So we find communities and groups within communities, and we support them financially to work on whatever they think the community needs. So this could be issues related to women's rights or workers' rights, or it could have to do with fishing and conservation issues. It just depends on what the community wants to work on. We believe that to build a sustainable solution to poverty, you have to have community engagement, and it has to build from the community up. So we go in and we find communities, and we help them do that. And finally, the third part of Oxfam is our campaigning and advocacy department, which I work out of. And we actually work to change the structures that actually keep people poor. So we do this through general advocacy and outreach work. We do this through legislative work. We have an office in DC that works a lot on Capitol Hill on policy issues and to bring our issues into current legislation. And right now, Oxfam's priority campaign, not only Oxfam America's priority campaign, but Oxfam International's priority campaign, is focused on climate change and how it affects the world's poorest communities. And I'm going to see if I can figure out how to do this. Voila. All right. The face of a changing climate. Right here, this is the face of global climate change. There's 2 children in Mauritania where Oxfam helped villagers build a dam to provide water for crops and irrigation. And this is also the face of climate change. This is Yum Yira of Cambodia. She says that when I was a girl, I never saw a flood. I worry about my grandchildren and how they will deal with floods. So you probably know a lot about global warming by now. It's the end of the workshop. And you probably have already been doing your part to go green and to reduce your carbon footprint. But climate change actually, as you probably know, affects our entire planet. It affects our natural resources, our wildlife, and our people all around the world. But unfortunately, it's the world's poorest who are most vulnerable to climate change and its consequences, and they're the ones that are affected the first and the worst. Over the course of 100 years, people have developed ways of coping with the changing weather conditions. Each season, as we know, is slightly different than the previous one, but we have been anticipating this changing climate, and generations after generations have learned to adapt to this. But what happens when the seasons become less predictable and conditions more difficult to manage? What happens when human activities like burning coal, oil, natural gas, and things like that change the climate? Not for the season, but for the long term. And when that happens, it's the world's poorest who are affected the most, because they're the ones that don't have the resources to cope with these changes or adapt, as Oxfam might use a word like adaptation. This map shows the global CO2 emissions per capita, measured in tons. You'll see that people in developing countries produce far fewer emissions than people in wealthier countries. For example, in the light colors of Africa, where many communities are already feeling the effects of climate change. Emissions per person average less than 1/20th of the levels of the United States. And even though they produce fewer carbon emissions, people living in developing countries are more than 20 times more likely to be affected by climate-related disasters than those people who live in the developed world. And so for poor communities, the effects of climate change can be absolutely devastating. For instance, developing countries are facing growing water shortages, with more than 1 billion people likely to face inadequate water supplies by mid-century. This water shortage, along with extreme weather events and rising temperatures, will lead to increased food shortages. In some African countries, yields from rain-fed crops could be cut in half by 2020. Diseases like malaria are spreading. The risk of malaria transmission is doubled over the coming 20 years for most of Southern and Central Europe. And according to the WHO, the World Health Organization, climate change may already contribute to about 150,000 deaths per year. Because of climate change, conflicts and migration are likely to intensify as a result of increased competition for scarce natural resources. And according to a report by a panel of retired US generals and admirals, climate change acts as I quote, a threat multiplier for instability in some of the most volatile regions of the world. And climate change can also deepen poverty. Climate-related disasters not only disrupt livelihoods, they also undo years and years of development that groups like Oxfam have worked on, and they impede growth. In Ethiopia, for example, during an increased rainfall, the country's GDP drops. And one thing that Oxfam will be focused on, this will change, is women, women in poor communities. It's women in poor communities and countries that are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. They often actually depend on rainfall to feed the crops rather than irrigation, like the men in developing countries. Women are typically responsible for the household's water. They're responsible for the food and the fuel supply. And they are the least likely to have education, to have opportunities and resources they need to adapt to the impacts of climate change. In addition, women's traditional role as caretakers means that they have little time for taking part in community discussion, so their perspectives are often not heard on this issue. However, at the same time, many women in both rich and poor countries are powerful as their role as consumers and their role as citizens. Many are aware of the importance of protecting the environment for future generations. Their role in the household means that they have valuable influence over the household's consumption patterns and lifestyle choices. And when women create networks and organizations, they can be a powerful force for social and political change. And for that reason, Oxfam is launching a project this fall called Sisters on the Planet. It is a series of documentary films about 5 women from 5 different countries who have been impacted by climate change. And it's going to be used as an educational piece. And one of those documentary films is going to be from about a woman from the Gulf Coast that Oxfam has been working with. And we're going to be distributing this across the country as an outreach tool and have premier screenings and things like that around the country. So that's one interesting project that you all could possibly be involved in. So, Oxfam, it's Oxfam America Project. Well, it will be launched in August, and so if I have a sign-up sheet, and at the end you can give me your name, and I can make sure that you get a copy of the documentary. Yeah. It's called Sisters on the Planet. And as we know, climate change is not a problem, just a problem for the future. It's actually happening now. We're seeing that effects are occurring faster than scientists first predicted, that climate-related disasters are becoming more and more frequent, And millions of people are being affected each year, and that number is growing. And I don't want to like make this like a bleak picture at all, but like there is an awful lot of hope and opportunity here. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon says, there he is, let us recognize the effects of climate change. Let us recognize that the effects of climate change affect us all, and that they have become so severe and so sweeping that only urgent global action will do. We are all in this together. We must work together. And at Oxfam, as I said, we believe in creating solutions to poverty means creating equitable solutions to the climate crisis, and that's why we're involved in this issue, and this is why we're making it one of our priority campaigns for the year. We've spent decades helping people earn a better living, strengthen their communities, and protecting their rights. But climate change right now will and has already begun to undermine some of that work. And so that's why we're advocating for a truly comprehensive response to global warming, one that not only addresses the causes of climate change, but also responds to the needs of the poorest communities around the world. And Oxfam believes that the U.S. should help out poor communities with this problem, because they have both the resources to help people adapt, and they have the responsibility to tackle this crisis. As one of the leading global powers in this world, and one of the world's biggest historical polluters, the U.S. really needs to step up and take the lead on tackling climate change, along with other countries in the developed world, Germany, France, Australia. We all have the resources to help poor communities adapt to the climate crisis. And I do want to make a note that while some big developing countries, as we probably know, have been increasing their production of greenhouse gas emissions, they're not among those countries that have been most historically responsible for causing the climate change. So countries like China and India will definitely play an important role in terms of reducing their greenhouse gas emissions because of their size and their rapidly rising emissions. However, any global agreement should address the role played by those countries, but it should also account for the imbalance of wealth and resources between developing countries and rich countries. So what do we need to do? We need to stop harming, start helping, and establish fair solutions. This is Oxfam's little motto for our climate change campaign. So first, we need to stop harming vulnerable communities by dramatically reducing our emissions. And we need to help prevent the global temperature rise of 2 degrees Celsius, which is the point of no return, as I'm sure you've already heard, the point at which the world may experience dangerous shocks to its water sources, food production, sea levels, and ecosystems. However, even if the world stopped polluting today, we would still feel the effects of climate change. So that's why we need to start helping. And so we must provide developing countries with the resources that they need to cope. And most often this will be funding, and this funding will help communities adopt innovative ways to adapting to the climate crisis. And Oxfam calls these, and the rest of the international community calls these adaptation projects. And then lastly, we need to establish fair solutions. We need to create climate policies that benefit rather than harm poor people at home and abroad, especially low-income energy users in the United States. So I'm going to go into a little bit about adaptation and adaptation projects, if that's okay. So what do adaptation projects do? In all countries facing the impacts of climate change, the key is to build resilience, beginning at the community level. People living in villages and towns must be able to respond and adapt to the shifting and frequently unexpected conditions that climate change brings. And of course, depending on the community and depending on where you're located in the world, adaptation needs will vary based on the conditions faced by communities. There's not going to be one solution for everybody out there. So there will be a lot of needs that need to be met. For instance, communities around the world, climate change adaptation will be essential to address water scarcity that jeopardizes safe drinking water and agriculture. They will need to cope with the excessive water, including floods and sea level rise, minimize the risk from severe wet weather events, improve agricultural practices and diversify agricultural livelihoods, find new ways of earning a living, improving health systems to address climate-related diseases and other health impacts, and address social impacts that stem from climate challenges that include migration and increased conflict over natural resources. And at times, however, the challenges will be new and different. So communities must have the flexibility to meet new challenges caused by climate change. For instance, some communities will have to adapt to rapidly melting mountain glaciers created by unprecedented floods now and lead into scarcer water supplies in the future. So those communities will first have to respond to unfamiliar conditions by creating flood warning systems in the short term, and then in the long term, they may have to change the type of crops that they grow. And to be most effective, the broad range of community adaptation efforts will have to be integrated into the broader efforts of community development and poverty reduction. Sorry, I'm having trouble with this clicker. And so I'm going to just take a look at a couple adaptation projects around the world that already exist. And these are programs that have started with the help of indigenous knowledge and local and national programs and assistance from NGOs around the world. And there's 4 projects that, these are all Oxfam projects that I'm going to take a look at. I might just take a look at a couple of them depending on how much time that we have left. First, emergency measures like raised homesteads can help people live with floods. So for instance, in Bangladesh, this right here is a woman in Bangladesh, and she's floating on a flooded river on a collection of trash. The people of Bangladesh, as you probably know, are no stranger to floods. The country's low-lying landscape, coupled with its position on the Ganges Delta, means that it's always been susceptible, and that people have always had to cope with consequences. But recently, the weather of recent years has come to a shock to even them, and it's threatening their security. For these people, increasing temperature does not mean long and pleasant summers, but an awful combination of rising sea levels, unpredictable rainfall patterns, and overflowing rivers caused by the snow melting in the Himalayas. And so with Oxfam's support, some communities in Bangladesh have developed survival strategies. So measures like raising their homesteads, providing rescue boats, and instituting flood early warning systems are helping millions of people adapt to this change in weather pattern. But this will need to be replicated on a massive scale for millions of people if the changes in climate continue. In Gambia, cereal banks have been created to prevent famine during food shortages. And this is a simple solution promoted by one of Oxfam's local partner organizations that takes the edge off of the question, if there's not enough food, what do I do if there's a food shortage? And so if villagers have a way to save some of their food during times of shortage, they can at the end of the harvest, they can have a reserve to fall back on, and so that they will put this reserve in these cereal banks. And so Oxfam's partner actually built, one of our partners has built 4 cereal banks in the Gambia. And each one is the size of a small house, and it can hold up to 33 tons of cereals. And it's located at strategic points around the community. And so villagers then formed a committee to manage the stored supplies, and those who borrow from the storehouse are obligated to pay back with a little extra tagged on so that the project can grow. People like the 2 women showed here now have a cheap available food supply in times of environmental or economic crisis. And in Ethiopia, data collection has helped communities plan for the better responses in times of a drought. In 2006, Oxfam, along with the Harvard University Humanitarian Initiative, launched an early surveillance project in Ethiopia. And the goal was to help officials in the region track public health trends that would warn them in advance about which droughts could become killers. I think this is quite an interesting project. It starts with the data collectors making a commitment to take a monthly trek to 5 far-flung households in each of the 4 villages that they've targeted. The data collectors are all women, and it's the women of the households that the data collectors come to see and interview, because they're the ones with the hard facts about the well-beings of their families. It's the women who are available most of the time because the men are away, and the women have been keeping mental tabs on what's been happening with them and what's been happening with others over the past few years. And so they can answer questions about the water levels in the streams and the ponds, and the number of meals that their children are getting, and the health of the other community members in the past. And so this information is collected and then becomes part of an early warning system that Oxfam has helped to develop so that communities in Ethiopia can quickly tackle problems related to changes in local conditions. And then in Peru, alpaca shelters, acres of barley, and radio towers help mountain communities prepare for cold weather. At nearly 16,000 feet above sea level, in the air in the Cayoloma district of Peru is so thin that newcomers actually will lose their breath. So the people who live here, like this alpaca herder, all the people who live here are normally alpaca herders, like this one who's, I'm going to butcher his name, but his name is Isubio, and I'll just say his first name. Oxfam's mission here is to make sure that when trouble does come, as it has in the past, and surely will again because of the changing weather patterns, that people like Isubio will be able to cope. So a few years ago, in June and July of 2004, after a severe cold snap wiped out tens of thousands of llamas and alpacas across Peru, Oxfam and one of our local partners, we joined forces to make sure that that didn't happen again. And so today, there are acres of barley that now grow on the slopes to buffer against food shortages for the livestock, and there are new adobe sheds with metal roofs that stand on the coldest mountain peaks, offering shelter for the alpacas that they've never had before. So those are just some of the adaptation projects that Oxfam is working on. But there are limits, obviously, to what vulnerable communities can achieve on their own. They need national and international support. So what exactly are we talking about? First, we need urgent action. The longer we wait, the higher the costs are going to be. Industrialized nations must begin reducing our emissions, and we must begin helping other nations reduce theirs through clean energy technology. A major economic review of climate change called the Stern Review projects that future costs of climate change under a business-as-usual scenario could equal the loss of 5 to 20% of gross world product annually. In contrast, the costs of taking action now on climate change will be likely to be several orders of magnitude below the cost of inaction. And taking action today means that industrialized nations must dramatically reduce their emissions, but also help poor communities adapt, as I've been saying. But poor communities need resources. These adaptation funds should be resources that are above and beyond the current financial foreign aid assistance that they're getting right now. So Oxfam believes that adaptation funds are seen more as compensation for their loss. It should be in addition to foreign aid. And in terms of how much it will cost, it'll cost a lot of money. $86 billion a year is what the UN Development Project predicts that it will cost. And that includes $44 billion for climate-proofing existing infrastructure, $40 billion to adapt existing development programs, and an additional $2 billion a year for disaster response. And so that's a lot of money, right? $86 billion. I can't actually even fathom how much $86 billion is. But it can do a lot to improve the lives of communities around the world. And let's look at a few things that it can do. Of this $86 billion a year, pilot projects that raise the foundations of 600 flood-prone mud houses in India can be constructed, and that's all for $70 per house. 2,000 farming households in Nicaragua practice conservation agriculture, tree planting, and water management, minimizing the impact of droughts and floods. And that's for $250,000. Communities in Vietnam plant over 54,000 acres of mangroves, providing 62 miles of protection for sea and river dikes to benefit 1.2 billion people in the area, and that's for $5 million. A project supports the Pacific Islands' adaptation to climate change. With this, throughout the region, communities are able to strengthen resource conservation and promote sustainable development for $82.4 million. So adaptation funds can do a lot for these communities. However, we must use our adaptation funds wisely. Things like accountability must be taken into effect. Governments and agencies must be held accountable for fair and distribution of these resources. The decision-making process for how adaptation funds are spent and which communities get it must be transparent and must involve local communities. Local people who already have indigenous knowledge to what's necessary to build resiliency in their community must be at the center of this decision-making process for adaptation projects. And primarily, oftentimes, we need to make sure that women and minorities are included in this community engagement. Capacity building. Adaptation funding must support development goals, such as improving livelihoods and human health. And effectiveness. Good adaptation projects will be programs that can be monitored and evaluated. So what can the U.S. do to help? Well, let's look what the U.S. has done in the past. So some developed country governments have contributed a total of $82.4 million to a global international adaptation fund called the Global Environmental Facility. But the U.S. has committed $0 to that, of that $82.4 million. There's an international adaptation fund as part of the Kyoto Protocol, but the U.S. does not belong to the Kyoto Protocol and says it will not participate in the adaptation fund, and that has around $100+ million per year. And although the USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, has begun to engage in these adaptation efforts, it's done so with limited and very uncertain amounts of funding. So nobody is really sure what's in that pot of money, if there's any. So how can we make the U.S. more effective? Because it's clear that they're not doing much. Right now, we need to push that the U.S. takes the lead on international negotiations. We have, a new presidency coming up, and whoever the new president is, he is going to be better on climate change than this current president, and I think that's pretty safe to say. I hope. The U.S. needs to pass climate change legislation in Congress, and again, with a new president, that might actually be possible. And then another thing that I'll just talk a little bit about later is we need to call on businesses, the private sector in the United States, to join this effort because they're affected too by climate change. And so why should the U.S. fund adaptation? One, it demonstrates good global leadership. I think it's no secret that the U.S. could stand to improve their standing in the world right now, and they would definitely demonstrate good global leadership if they take the lead and fund international adaptation efforts. It would help safeguard global security. So as you know, the access to natural resources is harder and harder for poor communities. That oftentimes will result in conflict around the world. So the U.S. should fund adaptation projects because it would safeguard global security. I mean, the obvious: responding now will save money down the road. And really, it's just the right thing to do. Promoting economic development in poor communities should be a national priority. And I think I want to say that you guys have probably already gone over this. We all know that the Kyoto Protocol expires in 2012, and right now over 100. The U.S. is actually a part of the negotiations to develop this new agreement that should be signed by 2009, goes into effect 2012. And negotiations are in progress right now, and this is the time for the U.S. to step up and take the lead. At the U.S. Conference on Climate Change in Bali in last December, these are some Oxfam polar bears. They're outside the meeting, and they have T-shirts that say "Save the humans too," because I mean, climate change is obviously it's about wildlife and natural resources, but it's also about people because we're also going to be affected. And so, our polar bears were just making that statement. Okay, so taking action in the U.S. The U.S. Climate change legislation could set the precedent and help communities all over the world. Right now, if we do, when we do have the opportunity to pass climate legislation, Oxfam believes that part of the various options to cut emissions in the United States, including like cap and trade or carbon tax or other revenue generating policies, could be a way to build adaptation funding. So for cap and trade, for instance, if Congress requires companies to buy emission permits rather than giving them these carbon permits away, the revenue generated, some of that revenue generated could be put into an adaptation fund. The same with carbon taxes and things like that. And there's been a lot of lawmakers who have proposed various options out there. And we just want to say that any legislation that's passed should include an international and domestic adaptation provision to it. And then calling on businesses to help. I don't deal with the private sector a lot. We have a whole private sector team at Oxfam, but I think it's a very interesting angle to get into. Businesses will also have to start reducing their emissions, and they also may be interested in helping communities in poor countries adapt. And start to invest in adaptations. I was talking to the lead on our private sector team the other day, and she was talking about her discussion with Levi's denim apparel company, and she had sat down with one of their managers at the corporate level and had said, where do you get your cotton for your denim? And he was like, well, we get it, we source it mainly from West Africa. And she was like, well, the droughts are just going to intensify in West Africa, and the cotton prices are going to rise because the cotton production is going to deplete, and the cotton that you're going to be buying is going to be a lot more expensive. And they're like, oh, we never thought about that. Maybe we want to get involved in these adaptation fronts because. Not only can it affect agricultural prices, but climate change can also affect transportation routes too that people use to move the cotton or whatever they're sourcing. And so there are businesses that are interested in getting involved on the adaptation front as well. So our recommendations: advocate for adaptation funding, promote equitable ways of reducing emissions, and to build equity and fairness into adaptation funding. And what is Oxfam doing right now? Well, as I said, we're undertaking this campaign. It just started this year on the organizing front. We've had some policy people working on it for many, many years. But climate change is our priority. Climate change and adaptation is our priority campaign. And we've been doing political advocacy in the United States, international advocacy, as you solar polar bears with their T-shirts in Bali. We've been doing a lot of public awareness about raising the issue of the human impact of climate change. And we are continuing to work on the ground with communities to help them adapt. Right now, in terms of U.S. legislation, Oxfam was involved recently with this Lieberman-Warner Climate Security Act legislation. Essentially, it was a cap-and-trade piece of legislation, but a small percentage of the permits that were allocated for auction went to a global or an international adaptation fund. And Oxfam helped develop the wording in the bill for that. However, it was definitely seen as like kind of the first step to working on climate legislation that may be viable in Congress, and it died the beginning of this month in Congress, but it wouldn't have gotten through the president, we don't think anyway. So it would kind of just set the stage. So we may see something like that in the future in the Senate after the elections. There's also some pending legislation in the House right now that nobody is sure where it's going to go, but it also has an international adaptation provision in it as well. That is a bit stronger than what was in the Lieberman-Warner legislation. And as Representative Waxman from California has circulated a sign-on letter to a plan that he's proposed, and essentially the letter will eventually go to Speaker Pelosi, and his plan just incorporates what should be included in future climate legislation on the House side, and it includes a very strong international adaptation provision. So right now, lots of members of the House have signed on. So it's a good first step as well. People don't think anything will pass with this administration, as I said, so they're kind of waiting until November. Another opportunity for engagement is the elections. You know, Oxfam America is part of this group called the Climate Equity Campaign. It's a coalition of climate and development organizations who are advocating that the next president, whoever he may be, speak up on the issue of climate change on behalf of the world's poorest. And so we've been traveling around the country with speakers from developing nations who can speak firsthand about the impacts of climate change. So we've been to Denver and San Francisco and Minneapolis and DC, and we've been on the Hill, and we've been in the media as well, just asking the next president to address this issue. We also started a presidential petition that essentially asks the next president to take adaptation into account when he addresses climate change issues. And then another opportunity for U.S. action is, you know, the first 100 days of the new presidency, and the new administration has, as I said, has huge potential to take the lead on this climate crisis and the adaptation issue, and bring it to the forefront. So, get involved. Right now, and this is the part I wanted to get to, everyone has a part to play to tackle the climate crisis. And it would be great if you all could work to help get your students involved in Oxfam's campaign to promote adaptation to the climate crisis. And there are a number of ways I think people can do it, and a number of ways people can help out and things that people can do. And generally, it's right now we're in this stage where a lot of people don't know what adaptation is. The general public doesn't. And when people talk about climate change, you know, they're talking about reducing their carbon footprint and being green, which is great because we definitely need that. You know, that's a priority. You know, that's one of our platforms. But we also need to take into consideration that it's the world's poorest that are being hurt the most by climate change, and they're already feeling the effects. And so, first of all, like just an education educating your students, just educating your students on this issue is key, and getting them to educate others. So We encourage people to throw house parties or like after-school parties or something like that, and we provide materials. We'll have the Sisters on the Planet video out, so that could be one of the things that you do at the party, and just educate people about about the issue, and maybe get people to write letters to Congress at that time. And it doesn't, I mean, I don't think it really matters, you know, how old the student is. I mean, even if they're not in college. If they're not 18, if they're not eligible to vote, like getting letters from, you know, people of all ages, handwritten letters is very influential, can be very influential to Congress members. Emails tend to not be seen or read or anything like that, but handwritten letters from the staffers that I've talked to on the Hill do get noticed, especially if there's a lot of letters about one issue. And another way to get involved is to table at a community event. If there's a street festival going on, I have a couple of college students working at street festivals in Chicago this summer, just bringing Oxfam literature and getting signups for the presidential petition and educating people about the issue. So there's a lot of people doing that. I have volunteers who walk around the park actually and get signatures too, but that's kind of their own little thing that they want to do. Call on members of Congress to pass climate legislation. I talked about writing letters, setting up meetings with congressional offices. I think it's actually a really good experience for young people to set up a meeting with the not necessarily a member of Congress, but the office. And most people aren't. Unfortunately, most people in this world aren't engaged in the system, don't realize that, you know, as a voter that they, or as a constituent, that, you know, they have access to their public officials and that they can set up a meeting and talk to them about, you know, what issues concern them the most. So they don't have to be an expert on climate change and adaptation to set up a meeting with a staffer of, you know, Senator Durbin's office or whoever their rep is. They just, you know, have to be concerned and care. So a lot of people to do that.
Do you guys have names and contact information for teachers if they were to click on your site with local offices and phone numbers, addresses, so if their students are writing, they don't have to.
Yeah, if you go
one-stop shop for.
Well, house.gov and www.senate.gov is that area. I mean, if that's really helpful, I could have my intern put something like that together. We do have a how-to. I brought our action guides, which is kind of like a how-to set up a meeting with a member of Congress and how to write a letter to a member of Congress. So I have that there with me. So that would be a start. But it's generally pretty easy to find addresses. So you could just all focus on Senator Durbin, and that would just be one address. It's easy to look up. Writing a letter for the school paper, a letter to the editor, an editorial, just to get the issue across is something that can play like a major role in campaigns. I've been involved in lots of different kinds of organizing on different issues, and media is just key. Like, you got to get the media on your side, and just constantly hitting them with letters to the editor and editorials is helpful. I have the Oxfam's petition, just getting signatures for that, or just, you know, taking a moment to sign your own name to the petition, you know, to say that you support this issue is you know, the very least that somebody can do is sign their name to a petition. And then Oxfam has a lot of online resources as well that I encourage people to use. One thing that schools normally love to use is our hunger banquet activity. I don't know if anybody has heard of the Oxfam Hunger Banquet before. Yeah, well, essentially it's the simulation of the global inequities in the world, and it's a little activity. You know, you get a group of people together. When they walk into a room, they draw a name, and they each represent a person around the world, a different person around the world. And so you could represent somebody in Nepal who, you know, lives on less than $1 a day and is being, you know, impacted by the climate crisis. with the melting glaciers from the Himalayas or something like that, and doesn't have access to a lot of food. Or you could be, a CEO of, a big corporation in the United States, and depending on which card you draw, you either sit at a table and have a 5-course meal for dinner, or you sit on the floor and you have rice and water, and then there's an in-between thing. And then there's also a script that goes with it, and that's all available online on OxfamAmerica.Part/climate. That's been a pretty popular activity that's been used for the last couple of decades by organizations, schools, and communities around the country that Oxfam created. And we have all the resources that you would need to actually to do one of those. We have a how-to booklet that has the script in it. It tells you how many people you need, what you need to get beforehand, and things like that. And usually it's very easy to get somebody to donate some food or something like that to participate. So, and I believe I am at time. So if you have any questions, I have my cards here. I have the action guide that I wanted to pass around. I also have the presidential petition if you would like to sign it yourself.